whispering, Are you military? And Ava gave a faint, tired smile while tightening the zip ties she had taken from the counter around the robber's wrists and replied, Something like that. But the twists of the night were far from over because when the police arrived minutes later, the officers recognized the name on her identification immediately, and their expression shifted from routine professionalism to stunned respect because Lieutenant Ava Carter wasn't just any service member. She was part of a classified SEAL team known for operations that never made the news, missions in places most people couldn't pronounce, and suddenly the criminals realized the terrible mistake they had made, threatening someone whose entire career revolved around surviving far worse situations than a convenience store robbery. And as paramedics carried the injured gunman past her, he stared up at her with fear and confusion, asking weakly, Who are you? And Ava simply picked up her water bottle from the floor, as if the chaos around her had been nothing more than an inconvenience, before answering quietly, Someone you should never point a gun at. And the officers couldn't help exchanging looks of disbelief at how quickly everything had unfolded, because the security footage would later show the entire fight lasting only 9 seconds from the moment the Glock touched her face to the moment all three attackers were on the ground, a fact that would circulate quietly through the precinct for weeks as one of those stories that sounded too unbelievable to be true, yet was captured perfectly on camera. And as Ava stepped outside into the cool rain, the flashing red and blue lights reflected across the wet pavement, while her tow truck finally pulled up at the curb, as if the night had simply resumed its normal rhythm. And she climbed onto her motorcycle once it was fixed, pulling on her helmet while one of the officers asked half-jokingly, Lieutenant, you sure you don't want to ride home? And she shook her head with a small grin, replying, I've had rougher nights. Before the engine roared to life, and she disappeared down the dark street, leaving behind three criminals who would spend the rest of their lives remembering the moment they asked a simple question, Any last words? And discovered the terrifying cost of threatening a Navy SEAL. And if that story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might be even more unbelievable than this one. Before we begin, if you love intense stories filled with shocking twists, hidden identities, and moments that make your heart race, make sure you hit subscribe and join thousands of viewers who come here for unforgettable stories every single day. Because today's story starts with a simple question that a group of criminals thought was their final moment of power. Any last words? But they had no idea the woman staring back at them wasn't a helpless victim. She was a Navy SEAL, and in a few minutes, their entire world would collapse. It was close to midnight in a quiet part of Norfolk, Virginia, where the rain fell in thin silver lines against the streetlights, and the city had settled into the uneasy silence that only comes after long days and tired people. And inside a small convenience store at the corner of Harbor Street, a woman stood near the refrigerator section holding a bottle of water, dressed in simple jeans, a gray hoodie, and worn running shoes, the kind of person anyone would glance at for half a second and then forget completely. Which was exactly the point, because Lieutenant Ava Carter had spent most of her adult life mastering the art of being invisible when she needed to be, and tonight she had only come here because her motorcycle had broken down 2 blocks away and she needed water and a phone charger while waiting for a tow truck. But fate had other plans, because the door suddenly burst open and 3 men rushed inside wearing black hoodies and masks, one jumping the counter while another locked the door, and the third pulled out a Glock that looked far too comfortable in his hand. And the teenage cashier froze with fear as the gunman barked orders while shoving a backpack across the counter demanding money. And Ava slowly set her water bottle down, eyes scanning every corner of the room, the way years of training had conditioned her to do automatically. The positions of the men, the distance between them, the reflection in the freezer glass, the rhythm of their breathing, the nervous twitch in the gunman's wrist that told her he wasn't experienced, but was definitely dangerous. And she quietly raised her hands like any ordinary civilian would while her mind calculated a dozen possible outcomes in seconds. But then something went wrong when the third robber noticed her watching too carefully and stepped closer, suspicious, pressing the cold barrel of the Glock directly against her cheek, while the other 2 laughed, and one of them said with cruel amusement, Look at her, thinks she's smarter than us. And the gunman leaned closer until she could smell the cheap alcohol on his breath, before whispering the words that would soon haunt him forever. Any last words? And for a moment, the entire store seemed to hold its breath as rain tapped softly against the windows and the humming refrigerators buzzed in the background, and Ava Carter slowly turned her eyes toward him, calm in a way that instantly unsettled the man holding the gun because it wasn't the slow reaction he expected. There was no begging, no trembling, just a quiet, almost tired expression, like someone who had seen this kind of situation too many times before, and she spoke softly enough that only he could hear, "Yeah, you should have picked another store." And before his brain could process the meaning behind those words, everything happened faster than any of them could comprehend, because Ava moved with the kind of speed that only comes from years of brutal training and real combat experience, twisting her head just enough to redirect the barrel of the Glock as her hand snapped upward, grabbing the slide, while her elbow slammed into the man's throat, and the gun fired. But the bullet shattered a glass refrigerator door instead of her skull, and in the same fluid motion she ripped the weapon from his grip and kicked his knee sideways with a crack that echoed through the store as he collapsed screaming, while the second robber turned in shock, reaching for a knife he had tucked into his belt. But Ava had already pivoted, using the injured gunman's body as a shield while stripping the magazine from the Glock and tossing it aside before driving the empty weapon into the attacker's temple hard enough to drop him instantly. And the third robber, who had been stuffing cash into the backpack, froze in disbelief, staring at the scene unfolding in front of him, as if reality had suddenly broken, because the quiet woman they thought was an easy hostage had dismantled his crew in less than 5 seconds, and panic surged through him as he pulled out another pistol from his jacket with shaking hands. But Ava didn't even look afraid as she stepped forward calmly and said, "You don't want to do that." And something in her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty that made his finger hesitate on the trigger. Yet desperation pushed him forward anyway, and he fired twice, the shots thunderous in the small store. But Ava had already moved, diving behind a snack aisle before springing forward again with terrifying precision, grabbing a metal display rack and slamming it into him like a battering ram that sent him crashing into the counter where the stunned cashier ducked for cover. And seconds later, the robber was pinned face down on the floor with Ava's knee pressing into his spine while she twisted his arm behind his back until the gun clattered away. And only then did she finally exhale slowly while reaching into her pocket and pulling out a small badge case that flipped open with a quiet click, revealing the unmistakable insignia of the United States Navy, along with the trident of a SEAL. And the room fell silent, except for the groaning criminals and the distant wail of approaching sirens, because someone outside had already called the police after hearing the gunshots, and the teenage cashier stared at her with wide eyes.